Welcome to Serial Killer Files, where we take another deep dive into the darkest corners of the human psyche. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're exploring one of America's most prolific serial killers, a man who terrorized the Pacific Northwest for decades, leaving a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions. This is the story of Gary Leon Ridgway, better known as the Green River Killer. But this isn't just another recounting of murders and mayhem. Today, we're going behind the scenes, into the mind of a predator, through the eyes of those who knew him best. His wives, his girlfriends, even fellow serial killer Ted Bundy, who provided chilling insights into Ridgway's methods. We'll uncover the warning signs that were there from childhood, the twisted psychology that drove him to kill, and the shocking revelations that emerged during his interrogation. What makes a monster? How does someone who appears ordinary, a truck painter, a churchgoer, a husband, become one of the most dangerous predators in American history? The answers are more disturbing than you might imagine. Looking for a gripping true crime fix? Scoob brings you Serial Killer Files, a quick, binge-worthy podcast that dives deep into the minds of history's most notorious killers like Gary Ridgway, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and more. Short, intense, and packed with insights. Scoob is your go-to for true crime stories that keep you hooked. Listen to real and raw stories anytime, anywhere. Ready to uncover how the darkest impulses took root? Let's begin with the early signs that foreshadowed the chilling legacy of the Green River Killer. Every monster has an origin story, and Gary Ridgway's begins in childhood with warning signs so textbook they could have been pulled from a criminal psychology manual. Fire, animals, and aggression, the infamous triad that so often predicts future violence. As a child, Ridgway wasn't just troubled, he was a case study in nascent psychopathy. He had an obsession with fire that went beyond normal childhood curiosity. He actively engaged in arson. Animals became his first victims. He tortured them with a cruelty that would later find human targets. One particularly disturbing incident involved suffocating a cat to death, an act that demonstrated both his capacity for violence and his complete lack of empathy. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of young Gary's development was his relationship with his mother, Mary Rita Ridgway. This wasn't your typical difficult mother-son dynamic. Ridgway confessed to having an unusual sexual attraction toward his mother, a toxic mix of lust and humiliation that would poison his relationships with women for the rest of his life. Picture this, a teenage boy still wetting the bed, being bathed by his mother who would wash his genitals. These memories burned themselves into Ridgway's developing psyche, creating what he would later describe as fantasies about showering with prostitutes. But the attraction came with violent undercurrents that reveal the true depth of his psychological damage. Ridgway admitted to harboring thoughts of murdering his mother, not just fleeting angry thoughts that many might have, but detailed fantasies about stabbing her, cutting her, even setting fire to their house with her trapped inside. When questioned about these fantasies later, he tried to downplay them, claiming they were just whims of wanting to cut her, not completely defile her body. But the fact remains, the woman who should have been his first source of love and security had become, in his twisted mind, an object of both desire and homicidal rage. The academic struggles only made things worse. Ridgway was a slow learner, a poor reader, someone who couldn't keep up with his peers intellectually. This created a perfect storm of inadequacy, sexual confusion, and violent impulses that would eventually explode into a decades-long killing spree. And then there was the stalking. Even in elementary school, Ridgway was what investigators now call trolling for victims. He would secretly follow girls home from school, using these stalking sessions as a form of sexual arousal. He would imagine his targets as goals to be achieved, turning human beings into objects in his fantasy life long before he would literally objectify them in death. One incident from the late 1960s provides a chilling preview of what was to come. Ridgway picked up a young woman from the Seattle Center, ostensibly to give her a ride home. But once he had her isolated, away from the main road, he attempted to coerce her into sex, fondling her breasts against her will. In a moment that must have saved her life, something held him back. He allowed her to exit his vehicle unharmed. This wasn't mercy. It was a predator, still learning his craft. The incident reveals the pattern that would later define his crimes. The initial approach under the guise of help or normalcy, the isolation of the victim, the attempt at control, and then, well, future victims wouldn't be so lucky. Future victims wouldn't be allowed to simply walk away. Understanding Gary Ridgway requires understanding his fundamental inability to connect with other human beings as equals. Dr. Mary Goody and Dr. Judith Becker, who studied Ridgway extensively, painted a picture of a man whose crimes weren't born from sadistic pleasure, but from crushing inadequacy and the complete absence of genuine intimacy in his life. Dr. Goody theorized that Ridgway's murderous actions were deeply connected to his neurological issues and his constant frustration at feeling invisible and undervalued. Here's the chilling part. She didn't believe Gary initially set out to murder his victims. Instead, something would go wrong during sexual encounters, and choking became his instinctive reaction when his fantasies were thwarted. Think about that for a moment. These weren't premeditated murders in the traditional sense. They were the violent outbursts of a man so emotionally stunted that he literally couldn't handle sexual disappointment without killing. Over time, as his killing spree continued, he began to derive a twisted sense of accomplishment from murder. It became the one area in his life where he felt truly skilled, granting him a sense of power and self-worth he couldn't find anywhere else. Dr. Becker saw the crimes through a different but equally disturbing lens. After 2 failed marriages, Ridgway had turned to prostitutes, trapping himself in a cycle of self-loathing. He considered himself a failure in sexual relationships, and his use of prostitutes only guaranteed the continued absence of real emotional connections. These weren't relationships. They were transactions that reinforced his view of women as objects to be used. His 3rd marriage to Judith provided some semblance of the intimacy he desperately needed, but even this fell short of his idealized desires. The evidence? He continued using prostitutes during and after their marriage. However, Ridgway himself claimed he had slowed down after meeting Judith, and this assertion appears to be genuine. Judith's presence in his life may have inadvertently prevented further murders, though we'll never know exactly how many lives her influence saved. What's particularly telling is how investigators initially blamed Ridgway's mother for his violent tendencies. Early theories suggested that Mary Rita's parenting, combined with Gary's childhood bedwetting, had created a seductive dynamic that influenced his later behavior. But this theory was eventually dismissed due to lack of evidence, even after intensive investigation. More importantly, Gary's brothers were raised in the same household under the same conditions, yet neither exhibited similar violent tendencies. This suggests that whatever drove Gary to murder wasn't environmental. It was something organic, some fundamental difference in his brain that remains beyond our current scientific understanding. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire case. We can identify the warning signs, we can trace the psychological development, we can even understand the triggers. But at the end of the day, Gary Ridgway's capacity for violence seems to have been hardwired into his very being. Now let's shift from psychology to methodology. How does a serial killer operate undetected for decades? The answer lies in understanding territory, routine, and the art of hiding in plain sight. During surveillance of Gary Ridgway, authorities discovered something chilling. He knew the Pacific Highway South area near SeaTac Airport like the back of his hand. This wasn't just familiarity. This was mastery. He would cruise this highway and park in specific locations notorious for prostitution. Larry's Market at South 144th and Pacific Highway South, and a 7-Eleven at South 142nd and Pacific Highway South. These weren't random stops. These locations held deadly significance. Victims Sandra Gabbert, Kim Nelson, Tina Thompson, Denise Bush, Terry Milligan, Shonda Summers, Carol Christensen, and Yvonne Antosh all went missing from these very areas. Ridgway wasn't just hunting. He was returning to proven hunting grounds, places where he knew vulnerable women would be available and where he could operate without arousing suspicion. His behavior during surveillance revealed the methodical nature of his predation. He would dine at fast food establishments in the area regularly, maintaining a normal presence that allowed him to blend into the landscape. He made consistent visits to his parents' residence, using these trips as cover for his more sinister activities. On one occasion, surveillance teams watched Ridgway travel to Rainier Avenue South, where he drove back and forth multiple times between Seward Park Drive and Andover Street. This area was another well-known prostitution hub, and several Green River victims, Lisa Yates, April Buttram, Pammy Evant, and Mary West, had disappeared from this exact location. But it was Ridgway's driving behavior that truly revealed his predatory nature. He drove noticeably under the speed limit, his attention constantly focused on his surroundings. He would exhibit bizarre driving patterns, abruptly turning off Pacific Highway South, navigating through side streets to reverse direction, then heading back on the highway with no apparent legitimate purpose. These weren't the actions of someone lost or confused. These were the calculated movements of a hunter scanning for prey. On October 17, 2001, detectives followed Ridgway from his workplace at Kenworth Trucking to his home in Auburn. Instead of taking the direct route via Interstate 5, he chose Pacific Highway South, the heart of his hunting territory. During this trip, his speed fluctuated unpredictably, and observers noted how he became distracted by a woman on the street whose demeanor suggested she might be working as a prostitute. 6 days later, on October 23rd, officers again observed his commute. Ridgway made his usual short visit to his mother's house, but it was his behavior after leaving that caught their attention. He executed 2 inexplicable U-turns on the highway, his speed varying from slow to fast, as though he were searching for something specific. This wasn't random driving. This was a predator's patrol, a systematic survey of territory he knew would provide opportunities. The most chilling aspect is how routine it had become. These weren't special hunting trips. This was simply how Gary Ridgway moved through the world, always ready, always watching, always hunting. To truly understand a monster, sometimes you have to hear from those who loved him, lived with him, and somehow survived the experience. The women in Gary Ridgway's life provide a window into his character that no amount of criminal profiling could achieve. Let's start with Marcia Winslow, his ex-wife, whose guided tour with detectives reads like a roadmap to horror. On September 14, 1986, Detectives Doyen and Haney accompanied Marcia on a journey through her shared past with Ridgway, not knowing they were retracing a killer's learning ground. The tour began on Highway 18, where Marcia pointed out a small dirt road near the I-90 junction, where she and Ridgway often went for intimate encounters around 1974. As they approached Carriston Road, the landscape had changed enough that Marcia couldn't definitively identify it as their old spot. What she didn't know was that just past the locked gate she remembered, the remains of Green River victim Amina Agashev had been discovered. As they continued toward the I-90 junction, they entered the densely wooded area where Tina Thompson's remains were found. Marcia identified this as a place she had visited with Ridgway multiple times, remembering occasions when they used shotguns and when Ridgway would wander into the woods to relieve himself. Every fond memory was tainted by the knowledge of what these places would later become. But perhaps most revealing were Marcia's observations about Ridgway's habits and behavior. She remembered how he always carried plastic Visqueen and a blanket in both their car and truck. He would bring plastic home from work at Kenworth, rolled up in his lunch pail. He had a habit of marking areas he liked on a standard Washington state map, places for camping and other interests. The religious phase she described is particularly chilling. After their son's birth, Ridgway became zealously religious, participating in door-to-door activities, but growing agitated when people refused to listen. This wasn't spiritual awakening. This was another form of control, another way to appear normal while feeding his need for dominance. Marcia also revealed the volatile dynamics of the Ridgway household. She described Gary's mother as the dominant figure in the family and painted a picture of dysfunction that included witnessing Mrs. Ridgway strike Gary's father with a plate in anger. When Marcia first met Gary's mother, she was surprised by her provocative appearance, heavy makeup and tight clothes that didn't align with her expectations. Most importantly, Marcia's tour revealed Ridgway's intimate knowledge of every area where bodies would later be recovered. From Greenwater to Enumclaw, from Auburn Federal Way to Star Lake Road, every location she identified as a place of shared intimacy became a dumping ground for victims. The camping sites, the berry-picking spots, the secluded areas where they were intimate, all of it became part of his killing field. But it was Gary's preference for backroads that truly reveals his methodology. Marcia explained how he avoided main highways, preferring routes like Peasley Canyon Road and Mount View Cemetery Road. He would use these trips to scavenge through garbage dumps, looking for salvageable items. This behavior provided perfect cover for scouting disposal sites while appearing to engage in harmless scavenging. The most heartbreaking aspect of Marcia's testimony is how normal it all seemed at the time. A couple taking drives together, camping, being intimate in scenic locations. These should have been beautiful memories. Instead, they were reconnaissance missions for future crimes, with Marcia unknowingly serving as cover for a serial killer's field research. Want the inside scoop on the world's most notorious serial killers like never before? Scoob takes you beyond the headlines and into the twisted dynamics of these ruthless killers. Uncover the secrets, red flags, and chilling behaviors that paint a portrait of serial killers hiding darkness behind familiar faces. Tune in to Scoob for stories you won't hear anywhere else. Now let's look closer at Gary Ridgway's intimate relationships, where a far darker pattern of control and obsession emerges. While Ridgway's ex-wife, Marcia, provided geographical insights, it was Ridgway's girlfriends who revealed the intimate details of his sexual psychology and the red flags that, in hindsight, screamed danger. Their stories paint a picture of a man whose sexual appetites were insatiable and whose need for control manifested in increasingly disturbing ways. Girlfriend A met Ridgway in May 1981 through Parents Without Partners, a social group for single parents. Their relationship moved quickly, with Ridgway soon moving into her West Seattle home. What stands out immediately is the intensity of their sexual relationship. They were intimate as frequently as 3 times a day. But it wasn't just the frequency that was concerning. It was the locations and circumstances. Their sexual encounters extended far beyond normal privacy, taking place outdoors in locations including the South Center area, Lincoln Park, Clay Elam, the Taylor River area near North Bend, and even at SeaTac Airport's North End. According to girlfriend A, it wasn't unusual for them to simply stop anywhere and engage in sexual activity, both inside and outside his truck. This wasn't romance, this was a compulsion. The bondage incidents she described are particularly revealing. After watching pornographic films together featuring bound women, Ridgway began incorporating rope bondage into their relationship. The first incident occurred during a camping trip outside Clay Elam, where Ridgway had secretly brought wooden stakes and nylon ropes. Without warning girlfriend A ahead of time, he drove the stakes into the ground and tied her wrists and ankles. But it wasn't just the bondage that was disturbing. It was what came next. Ridgway inserted grapes and bananas into her vagina, a degrading act that she consented to but found unsettling. Most concerning was her observation that she was bound tightly enough to be unable to free herself, completely dependent on Ridgway's willingness to release her. The second bondage experience occurred at her home, where Ridgway used rubber-coated wire from his truck to tie her to the bed. Again, he freed her when she asked, but the pattern was clear. Ridgway was experimenting with control, restraint, and the sexual thrill of having complete power over another person. Girlfriend A also noted Ridgway's extreme social isolation. He had virtually no friends and rarely spoke about his personal life. She described him as withdrawn and dominated by women, allowing her to make all decisions in their relationship. The intensity of their sexual relationship eventually became overwhelming, prompting her to ask him to leave in December 1981. Girlfriend B entered the picture immediately after Girlfriend A's departure, meeting Ridgway through the same Parents Without Partners organization. Her experience revealed different but equally disturbing aspects of his character. She suspected he had other sexual partners during their relationship and described him as having extremely low self-esteem rooted in his inability to please his mother. But it was an incident on Christmas Eve 1981 that provided the most chilling insight into Ridgway's double life. During a Parents Without Partners social function, Ridgway arrived visibly disturbed and confessed to Girlfriend B that he had nearly killed a woman. When she asked him to repeat himself, he confirmed the statement, but was interrupted before he could explain further. This confession was never revisited, but given what we now know about Ridgway's crimes, it takes on terrifying significance. Girlfriend C's account from early 1982 reveals the consequences of Ridgway's sexual behavior and his attitudes toward women. She contracted herpes during their relationship, which Ridgway claimed to have gotten from consorting with prostitutes. Her observations about his character are particularly insightful. She described him as having an immense sexual appetite, but noted an undercurrent of his possibly dehumanizing prostitutes. Most revealing was a conversation she overheard where Ridgway's frustration with his ex-wife Marcia was so intense that when asked if he could kill her, he answered affirmatively. Despite this disturbing revelation, Girlfriend C emphasized that she never saw him act violently toward anyone else, describing him as generally even-tempered and resolving issues through discussion rather than aggression. This contradiction, a man capable of discussing murder with apparent casualness while maintaining a facade of gentleness with his intimate partners, reveals the compartmentalized nature of Ridgway's personality. He could be tender with women he cared about while simultaneously viewing other women as objects to be used and ultimately discarded. In one of the most bizarre chapters of the Green River case, investigators turned to another serial killer for insights into Ridgway's methods. Ted Bundy, sitting on death row, provided an analysis that proved remarkably accurate and offered a window into the predatory mind that only another predator could provide. Bundy's assessment centered on what he called the riverman's extensive familiarity with his disposal sites. He believed that the killer exhibited no panic because he knew these areas intimately. They weren't random choices, but carefully selected locations where he felt completely comfortable and confident. The evidence supporting Bundy's theory was compelling. During the car tour with Marcia Winslow, she had pointed out numerous locations where she and Ridgway had bicycled and engaged in sexual activities. These included grassy banks near PD, and Jay meets in a spot under a large tree adjacent to a pond by the Peck Bridge, the exact location where Green River victims Caulfield, Bonner, Mills, Chapman, and Hines were discovered. Bundy's analysis proved prophetic. If Marcia's recollections were accurate, they corroborated his assessment that the riverman knew these areas intimately and was skilled at disposing of bodies without fear of detection. These weren't panic disposals by someone unfamiliar with the terrain. These were the calculated actions of someone who had spent years learning every back road, every secluded spot, every location where a body could be hidden. But Bundy's insights went beyond geography to methodology. He emphasized that the riverman would need a deep understanding of the prostitution environment to be successful. The killer was capable of quickly convincing victims to accompany him without attracting unwanted attention. This required familiarity with how to approach prostitutes, how to speak their language, and how to handle interactions quietly before swiftly departing the scene. Bundy referred to these encounters as mini abductions for cash, highlighting how they appeared transactional, but were actually pivotal moments in the predator's strategy. The killer had to understand the economics, the social dynamics, and the communication patterns of the prostitution world well enough to blend in seamlessly. The case of Kim Nelson perfectly illustrated Bundy's points. Kim had vanished rapidly from a bus stop in front of a car wash at South 144th and Pacific Highway South on November 1st, 1983. A few nights later, her friend Paige Miley encountered a man in a red pickup truck while working as a prostitute near the Moonrise Motel. After some conversation about a potential date, the man asked Miley about her blonde friend. This inquiry about Kim alarmed Miley because it revealed knowledge that seemed inappropriate for a casual customer. The man, described as a white male in his late 20s to early 30s with brown hair and a wispy mustache, appeared familiar enough with the environment to engage in proper terminology about car dates, while also demonstrating specific knowledge about Kim Nelson. Ridgway later confessed to killing Kim and admitted that his query to Paige was an attempt to gauge whether she suspected foul play. This confirms Bundy's analysis about the killer's deep integration into the prostitution scene. He wasn't an outsider awkwardly trying to navigate unfamiliar territory. He was someone who had spent years learning the language, the locations, and the social dynamics well enough to operate undetected. Another encounter that validates Bundy's theory involved prostitute Dawn White, who had a planned car date that was canceled due to police interference. When police dispersed White and her friend from Larry's Market parking lot, preventing the date, she later found the man's number in the telephone book, called him, and arranged another meeting. This level of follow-up and reconnection demonstrates exactly the kind of patient, methodical approach Bundy attributed to the riverman. Perhaps most chilling is how Bundy's analysis revealed the predatory nature of what appeared to be normal customer behavior. These weren't chance encounters or crimes of opportunity. They were the result of careful study, patient observation, and methodical planning by someone who had made killing his profession. We now arrive at perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Gary Ridgway's crimes, his necrophilic behavior and the twisted psychology that drove him to continue violating his victims even after death. This isn't just about the acts themselves, but what they reveal about the complete dehumanization at the core of his psyche. The first hints of this behavior came from Rebecca Gardguay, the sole known living victim of Ridgway's attacks in 1986. Her account to the Green River Murders Task Force was harrowing and prescient. During what was supposed to be a date, Ridgway had led her into the woods and removed all his clothing, yet showed no sexual interest or arousal toward her while she was alive. Rebecca found this perplexing. Why would someone strip without any apparent sexual motive? But the situation revealed its true horror when he attacked her. She described how his demeanor completely transformed. His face became pale, clammy, and cold, as did his hands and arms. He became like a different person, leading Rebecca to suspect that if he intended to kill her, His motive might have been necrophilic, given his complete lack of sexual interest when she was alive and responsive. This insight proved tragically accurate. 17 years later, when Ridgway finally confessed to attempting to murder Rebecca, he also began revealing his necrophilic tendencies. These inclinations had been suspected earlier, even by Ted Bundy, who speculated that staked-out body dump sites might be a method to catch the killer. Bundy, having confessed to revisiting his own victims' burial sites for intimate encounters, recognized similar patterns in the Green River Killer's behavior. Initially, Ridgway denied any necrophilic behavior, but gradually began acknowledging the truth to authorities. He admitted that he ejaculated immediately after strangling his victims. The killing itself had become sexualized. But this was just the beginning of his confessions. As interviews progressed, he opened up about performing post-mortem intercourse with the deceased women. Some victims, he confessed, were in such an advanced state of decomposition that maggots had started infesting their bodies. His casual description of these acts was chilling. He described a routine where, after work, he would engage in sexual acts with a corpse and continue doing so for 1 or 2 days until flies overran the body, at which point he would bury it and seek another victim. The compulsion was so intense that he undertook considerable risks to satisfy it. On one occasion, he recounted driving back to one of his victims' bodies while his son was asleep in the truck. Ridgway got out, had intercourse with the body just 30 feet away from his sleeping child, then rejoined his son. His cavalier attitude about this incident, reassuring detectives about his son's deep sleep, reveals the complete absence of normal human boundaries or protective instincts. When discussing his actions with a psychiatrist while in custody, Ridgway initially tried to rationalize his necrophilia as free sex. His twisted calculus was that when he initially approached victims for sex, he had to pay them, but after killing them, he simply took his money back. He argued this ignored the costs of energy, fuel, and time required to pursue new victims. However, he eventually admitted that achieving an erection with a corpse became challenging, leading him to abandon necrophilic intercourse altogether. This wasn't a moral awakening. It was a practical limitation that ended one aspect of his crimes. What makes this behavior even more significant is how it connects to Ridgway's selective denial of certain murders. When Ted Bundy expressed skepticism about 36-year-old Amina Agashev being a Green River victim due to her age, his observation proved prophetic. Ridgway was adamant about not having killed Agashev, passionately refuting the accusation with the words, "Because I have pride in what I do. I don't want to take it from anybody else." This statement reveals the twisted professional pride that serial killers can develop. Despite the plea bargain that protected him from the death penalty in exchange for comprehensive confessions, and despite admitting to crimes the police hadn't even connected to him, Ridgway refused to claim responsibility for Agashev's murder. The reason becomes clear when we understand his victim preferences. Ridgway told officers he preferred younger victims because they were easier to control, instilled less fear in him, and their pleas during his chokehold thrilled him. Agashev, being significantly older, was not only outside his victim profile, but may have actually repulsed him. Given Marcia Winslow's description of Ridgway's mother as a domineering woman with heavy makeup and tight clothes, and Ridgway's own confessions about violent and sexual fantasies involving his mother, a disturbing pattern emerges. His preference for teenage victim might have served as a subconscious diversion from the fury he harbored toward his mother, his true intended target. Young prostitutes were easy targets, as Ridgway admitted to detectives, and possibly served as surrogate victims. The violence he couldn't inflict on his mother was redirected toward vulnerable young women who, in his twisted psychology, somehow represented a safe alternative to confronting his original source of rage and sexual confusion. As we near the end of our journey into Gary Ridgway's psychological landscape, we must grapple with perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this entire case: how utterly normal he appeared to most people who knew him. This isn't a story about an obviously dangerous individual who somehow slipped through the cracks. This is about how true evil can wear the mask of ordinary life so convincingly that even those closest to it remain unaware. Girlfriend C's observations provide the clearest picture of this facade. She described Ridgway as generally even-tempered, someone who resolved issues through discussion rather than aggression. She characterized him as an attentive and gentle partner in their intimate relationship, noting they were physically intimate roughly twice daily. She emphasized to police that she never saw him act violently or with anger toward anyone. Yet this same gentle man had told her he could kill his ex-wife. This same even-tempered individual was simultaneously stalking prostitutes, refining his killing techniques, and fantasizing about necrophilia. The compartmentalization required to maintain such dramatically different personas speaks to a level of psychological sophistication that makes Ridgway infinitely more dangerous than a simple, impulsive killer. His lifestyle reinforced this image of normalcy. Girlfriend C noted that he maintained a nondescript appearance with typical attire of jeans and casual shirts. His habits included light beer consumption with no smoking or drug use. He held down a steady job at Kenworth Trucking, painting trucks and maintaining the facade of a working-class everyman. His aspirations seemed normal, too. He had tried to become a police officer after his Navy service, though he failed the examination. His leisure activities centered around flea markets and swap meets, hardly the pursuits one would associate with a serial killer. Even his living situation appeared unremarkable: a simple lifestyle in various trucks and vehicles, some borrowed from family connections. The religious phase that Marcia described adds another layer to his mask of normalcy. After their son's birth, Ridgway became zealously religious, attending first a Southern Baptist church and then a Pentecostal church. He participated enthusiastically in door-to-door evangelism, presenting himself as a committed Christian. Only his agitation when people refused to listen hinted at the control issues beneath the surface. This religious persona wasn't brief experimentation. It was a sustained performance that lasted years. Imagine the psychological effort required to maintain such an elaborate facade while simultaneously hunting, killing, and sexually violating victims. The energy needed to compartmentalize these contradictory aspects of his life speaks to a level of calculation that makes his crimes even more chilling. His family relationships also reinforced his normal appearance. He was a divorced father who maintained contact with his son, visited his parents regularly, and went through the motions of ordinary family interactions. Marcia's account of their shared activities, camping, fishing, swimming, picking berries, reads like a catalog of wholesome American family life. Yet every one of these innocent activities was simultaneously serving his darker purposes. The camping trips were reconnaissance missions for disposal sites. The drives through scenic areas were scouting expeditions for future crimes. The family time was cover for building detailed knowledge of every back road and secluded location in the region. Perhaps most disturbing is how his automotive hobby provided perfect cover for his crimes. His habit of painting trucks, switching between different vehicles, and working in garages gave him both the opportunity to alter his appearance to potential witnesses and the space to clean up evidence. What appeared to be innocent mechanical work was actually sophisticated crime scene management. The surveillance footage of his driving patterns reveals how seamlessly he blended predatory behavior with normal activities. His regular visits to fast food restaurants, his stops at his parents' house, his commute to and from work. All of this normal routine was interwoven with systematic hunting behavior. He could cruise known prostitution areas while appearing to simply be someone running errands or visiting family. This ability to hide in plain sight explains how Ridgway operated undetected for decades. He wasn't a reclusive outsider who attracted attention through bizarre behavior. He was the neighbor next door, the coworker in the next cubicle, the fellow churchgoer in the next pew. He understood instinctively that the best way to avoid suspicion was to be aggressively normal, to blend so thoroughly into the background of everyday life that no one would ever think to look closer. The girlfriends who shared intimate relationships with him, the ex-wife who bore his child, the co-workers who saw him daily, the family members who invited him to gatherings, none of them suspected they were interacting with one of America's most prolific serial killers. This isn't because they were naive or inattentive. It's because Gary Ridgway was exceptionally skilled at being exactly what people expected to see. Think you can spot a killer in the crowd? Think again. Scoob pulls back the curtain on how evil wears the most convincing disguise: normalcy. Discover the hidden darkness lurking behind everyday faces, and why the most dangerous monsters are often the ones nobody suspects. Download Scoob for a deeper understanding of the darkness we often fail to see. Take a deep dive into the lives of Gary Ridgway, Richard Ramirez, John Wayne Gacy, Aileen Wuornos, and more. As we conclude this deep dive into the mind and methods of the Green River Killer, we're left with questions that extend far beyond the specifics of Gary Ridgway's crimes. His case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil, the limits of our ability to detect it, and the vulnerability that exists in our everyday interactions with others. The warning signs were there from childhood: the fire obsession, animal cruelty, sexual confusion, violent fantasies, and social isolation. Criminal psychology textbooks describe these exact patterns as predictors of future violence. Yet somehow, this knowledge didn't prevent decades of killing. Why? How do we bridge the gap between academic understanding and practical prevention? His relationships with women reveal another disturbing pattern. Multiple partners experienced his sexual intensity, his need for control, his emotional detachment, and his compartmentalized behavior. Some even heard direct threats or confessions. Yet the connections weren't made until it was far too late. What does this tell us about our ability to recognize danger in intimate relationships? The expert analysis provided by Ted Bundy proved remarkably accurate, demonstrating that sometimes it takes a predator to truly understand another predator's methods. But this raises troubling questions about the nature of insight itself. Are we dependent on monsters to catch monsters? What does it say about our society that we turn to killers for understanding of killing? Perhaps most unsettling is how successfully Ridgway maintained his mask of normalcy. He wasn't a Hollywood villain, obvious and theatrical in his evil. He was a truck painter, a churchgoer, a neighbor, a father. He navigated social situations, maintained employment, participated in community activities, and appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be. This case reminds us that evil rarely announces itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious warning signs. More often, it hides behind familiar faces, ordinary routines, and carefully constructed facades. The monster doesn't live in a castle on a hill. He lives next door, drives the same roads you do, shops at the same stores, and may even attend the same church. Gary Ridgway confessed to killing 49 women, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But beyond the numbers, beyond the specific details of his crimes, his case serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist behind even the most ordinary exterior. The victims, Sandra, Kim, Tina, Denise, Terry, Shonda, Carol, Yvonne, Lisa, April, Pammy, Mary, and so many others, were real people with real lives, dreams, and families. They deserve better than to become statistics in a serial killer's tally. They deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings whose lives had value beyond their tragic endings. As for Gary Ridgway, he sits in prison today, serving life without the possibility of parole. The death penalty was taken off the table in exchange for his confessions and cooperation in locating remains. Some see this as justice. Others view it as insufficient punishment for such enormous evil. But perhaps the real question isn't what Gary Ridgway deserves. It's what we owe to future potential victims. How do we use the insights gained from this case to prevent others like it? How do we better identify the warning signs, support vulnerable populations, and create systems that don't allow predators to operate undetected for decades? These are the questions that matter now. The Green River Killer's story is over, but the lessons it teaches about human nature, criminal behavior, and the responsibility we all share to protect one another continue to resonate. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but necessary journey into the darkness. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember that the most important thing we can do in the face of such evil is to never stop caring about each other.